On the morning of February 20, the search for Carla Walker entered its fourth day. The young woman's disappearance had shaken Benbrook, a quiet community on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas. Friends, family members, and investigators were still holding on to hope that she would be found alive. Meanwhile, law enforcement teams continued searching rural roads and remote areas near Benbrook Lake, a region known for its open land and isolated stretches away from town. Any clue, no matter how small, had the potential to change the course of the investigation. During one of these searches, two officers noticed a drainage ditch beside a lightly traveled road. At first, it seemed like just another location that needed to be checked, but when they decided to take a closer look, they made a discovery that would change the entire case. Inside the ditch was the body of a young woman. The signs of violence were impossible to ignore. The blue dress she was wearing was torn and stained with blood. It did not take long for the officers to realize they were looking at a scene far more disturbing than they had anticipated. At that moment, the search for a missing teenager officially became a murder investigation. But the most chilling part was still to come. For decades, the identity of the man responsible for the crime would remain a mystery. And when the truth finally began to emerge, investigators uncovered details that no one could have imagined on that cold morning along the side of the road. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, it is important to know who Carla Walker was. In 1974, Carla was just 17 years old and lived with her family in Benbrook, a quiet community near Fort Worth, Texas. The daughter of Leighton and Doris Walker, she was known for her strong personality. Although she stood only about 5 feet tall, she made up for her small stature with a presence that was impossible to ignore. Family members and friends described her as determined, energetic, and blessed with a stubborn streak that often drove her to fight for what she wanted. At Western Hills High School, Carla was one of the most popular students. She had a natural ability to make friends and was known for greeting nearly everyone she passed in the hallways. Her constant smile and outgoing nature made her well-liked by both classmates and teachers. Outside the classroom, she was actively involved in school athletics. She was a cheerleader and a member of the tennis team, living the typical life of a teenager with big dreams for the future. A major part of that future involved Rodney McCoy. At 18 years old, Rodney was the quarterback and captain of the school's football team. The two had been dating for about a year, and their relationship was becoming increasingly serious. Rodney planned to attend Texas Tech University in Lubbock, and Carla intended to follow the same path so they could remain together. Their relationship was so serious that Rodney had already given Carla a promise ring. Over time, he had become almost a member of the Walker family. He spent many evenings at their home studying, talking, and sharing simple moments with Carla, her older sister Cindy, and the rest of the family. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like an ordinary young couple, full of plans and dreams for the years ahead. The evening of February 16, 1974, appeared destined to become one of the happiest memories of Carla Walker's youth. It was a special Sunday marked by Valentine's Day celebrations, and as it did every year, Western Hills High School was hosting its traditional dance for students. Shortly before the Valentine's Day dance, Rodney arrived at the Walker home to pick her up. When Carla appeared at the top of the staircase wearing a light blue dress decorated with white accents, the scene looked as if it had come straight out of a typical 1970s teenage romance. The couple climbed into Rodney's family's 1969 Ford Limited and headed to the school, where the gymnasium had been transformed for the celebration. Colorful streamers, paper hearts, and romantic decorations filled the room. The theme of the evening was "Love is a Kaleidoscope." The dance ended around 11:30 that night, but neither of them was ready for the evening to end. After driving around town with another couple and stopping at some of the most popular hangouts for local teenagers, Rodney and Carla eventually found themselves alone. It was already past midnight when Rodney parked in a lot near Brunswick Wrigley Bowl, a well-known bowling alley in the area. Carla quickly went inside to use the restroom and, when she returned, settled into the passenger seat. Resting her purse beneath her head like a makeshift pillow, she leaned against the door as the two talked about the evening they had just shared. The dance had ended only a short time earlier, and the couple was enjoying those final moments together before heading home. Eventually, conversation gave way to kisses, neither of them realizing that someone was watching from the darkness. Then, in a fraction of a second, everything changed. Without any warning, the passenger door was violently pulled open. Before Rodney could react, a man appeared and began striking him repeatedly in the head with the butt of a handgun. The attack was so sudden and brutal that he barely had time to understand what was happening. Blow after blow landed on his head. Dazed and covered in blood, Rodney struggled to make sense of the chaos unfolding around him. Through the confusion, he watched as the attacker grabbed Carla and dragged her from the vehicle. Despite his injuries, Rodney tried to stop the abduction, but the attacker turned the gun toward him and pulled the trigger. Once, then again, and a third time. For some reason, the gun never fired. As blood streamed into his eyes, making it difficult to see, Rodney fought to remain conscious. Then, amid the terror of that early morning attack, he heard Carla's voice for the last time. Desperate, she screamed, "Rodney, go get my dad! Go get my dad!" Moments later, everything went dark. By the time Rodney regained consciousness, it was already past 1 o'clock in the morning. Carla was gone, and no one had any idea that this was the beginning of one of the most shocking crimes in Texas history. When Rodney came to, he was disoriented and covered in blood. Despite his injuries, only one thought occupied his mind: finding help for Carla. Staggering and barely able to keep himself together, he managed to drive to the Walker family's home, located less than half a mile away. When he arrived, he rushed from the car and ran toward the front door. The blood streaming down his face made it obvious that something terrible had happened. Inside the house, the family was still awake. Leighton and Doris Walker were passing the time playing dominoes with relatives, while the children watched television in the living room. The calm of the early morning hours was shattered when Rodney began pounding frantically on the door. As soon as he managed to explain what had happened, panic swept through the house. Police were contacted immediately, and family members rushed to the location where Carla had last been seen. Before long, patrol cars surrounded the bowling alley parking lot. Investigators began examining the area for any clue that might lead them to the kidnapper. Among the items recovered were Carla's purse and a piece of evidence that immediately caught the attention of detectives: the magazine from the attacker's handgun. The discovery helped explain one remarkable detail from that night. When the attacker pointed the gun at Rodney and tried to shoot him, the magazine had already become detached during the struggle and fallen to the ground without the gunman realizing it. Rodney had escaped death because of an extraordinary stroke of luck. While crime scene technicians processed the area, other teams searched nearby streets, vacant lots, and surrounding properties for any sign of Carla. As daylight arrived, friends, neighbors, and family members joined the search effort. Despite the condition he was in, Rodney was able to provide a description of the man who had taken Carla. According to him, the suspect was a white male of medium build, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with short brown hair and wearing a vest. It was an important lead, but still a very limited one. By the morning of February 17, just hours after the abduction, the investigation had already mobilized law enforcement agencies across the region. With Carla still missing, detectives were racing against time, believing that any detail, no matter how small, could be the key to finding her alive. When classes began at Western Hills High School that Monday, investigators were sent to the campus to speak with students and staff members. They examined photographs taken during the dance the night before, searching for unfamiliar faces, suspicious behavior, or anyone who might have stood out. In the hallways, dozens of students were interviewed. Detectives wanted to know whether Carla had any enemies, whether she had received threats, or whether anyone might have had a reason to harm her. But the answers always led to the same conclusion: Carla was liked by nearly everyone. No solid leads emerged that day. Meanwhile, the search continued around the clock. The Benbrook Police Department received assistance from neighboring agencies, and volunteers joined the effort. With every passing hour, concern grew, but family members and friends still clung to the hope that Carla would be found alive. But while relatives, friends, and investigators continued to believe that Carla might still be rescued, the outcome was already drawing near. As mentioned earlier, 4 days after the abduction, on the morning of February 20, her body was discovered in a remote area near Benbrook Lake. From that moment on, the search for a missing young woman became a hunt for a killer who seemed to have vanished without a trace. The news shattered the family's remaining hopes and officially transformed the case into a homicide investigation. The autopsy would reveal an even more disturbing picture. Medical examiners concluded that Carla had likely survived for approximately 2 days after her abduction. During that time, she is believed to have endured violent assaults, sexual abuse, and ultimately strangulation. Toxicology testing also revealed the presence of morphine in her system, suggesting that she had been injected with the drug while being held captive. Investigators were able to recover important biological evidence, but the technology available in 1974 was nowhere near what exists today. DNA identification was not yet part of criminal investigations, preventing detectives from determining who had left behind those critical traces. Determined to find the person responsible, law enforcement established a 24-hour tip line to receive information from the public. Hundreds of calls came in over the following weeks. Many appeared promising at first, but none led investigators to Carla's killer. Among all the evidence collected, one item stood out: the magazine from the handgun used by the attacker. After examination, investigators determined that it belonged to a .22 Tausen .2 caliber Ruger pistol. It was one of the few pieces of physical evidence directly connected to the perpetrator. As a result, detectives requested assistance from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to obtain a list of people in the area who had purchased that model of firearm. They hoped that somewhere on that list would be the name of the man who had destroyed Carla Walker's life. Armed with the lead provided by the handgun magazine, investigators began tracking down potential owners of that specific pistol. The effort produced a list containing dozens of names. One by one, members of the task force interviewed every possible suspect, reviewing backgrounds, daily routines, and alibis. Despite their efforts, none of them could be connected to Carla's murder. Months passed without any significant breakthroughs. Then, nearly a year after the crime, detectives believed they had finally found someone who might be responsible. His name was Tommy Nealand. By that time, Tommy was already behind bars for a series of extremely violent crimes. Among them was the murder of Nancy Mitchell, a 27-year-old woman who disappeared in Texas in 1970. In later years, he would also be held responsible for other brutal killings involving teenage victims in the Fort Worth area. Investigators noticed troubling similarities between Tommy's criminal history and what had happened to Carla. Their suspicions grew even stronger when another incident came to light. In April 1974, just a few months after Carla's death, Tommy abducted a young woman in Arlington and attempted to assault her. His plan failed when his vehicle became stuck in the mud, giving the victim an opportunity to escape and seek help. Given his history, detectives spent hours questioning Tommy. During those interviews, he admitted involvement in several crimes for which he was already under investigation. But whenever Carla Walker's case was mentioned, his answer never changed. He denied having anything to do with it. Even so, investigators continued exploring the possibility that he was responsible. Over time, however, the evidence proved insufficient to connect him to the case. In the years that followed, other men also attracted the attention of law enforcement. Some even confessed to the crime. But as investigators dug deeper, those confessions ultimately turned out to be false, contradictory, or impossible to verify. While suspects came and went, one thing remained unchanged. Carla Walker's killer was still free. Decade after decade, the case survived changes in investigators, new theories, and countless hours of police work. And for the Walker family, the most important question remained unanswered. Who had taken Carla that night, and why? Although the years passed without answers, there was one person who refused to let the case fade into history: Carla's younger brother, Jim Walker. At the time of the crime, Jim was only 12 years old. The loss of his sister affected him so deeply that it shaped many of the decisions he would make throughout his life. As he grew older, he became obsessed with understanding the type of person capable of committing such a cruel crime. After graduating from high school, Jim attended college and began studying subjects related to criminal behavior. He read books about serial killers, researched notorious cases, and enrolled in psychology courses that could help him understand how violent offenders think. Deep down, there was one reason behind all of it. He wanted to discover who had taken his sister's life. When he returned to the Fort Worth area after finishing college, Jim had a clear goal in mind. Years earlier, the investigation into Carla's murder had been transferred from the small Benbrook Police Department to the Fort Worth Police Department, which had greater resources to pursue the case. Determined to help in any way possible, Jim decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. His plan was to rise through the ranks, become a detective, and one day gain access to the case files so he could personally help track down the man who had destroyed his family. But fate had other plans. During training at the police academy, while practicing at the firing range, Jim began experiencing vision problems. Medical examinations later revealed a congenital eye condition that prevented him from continuing a career in law enforcement. The diagnosis ended his dream of becoming a detective, but it did not diminish his determination. Even without a badge, Jim continued following the case closely. Over the years, he and his parents remained in frequent contact with the Fort Worth Police Department. Whenever they called seeking updates, they received nearly the same response: the investigation had made no significant progress. Time continued to move forward. Decades passed without an arrest, without a trial, and without definitive answers. Tragically, Leighton and Doris Walker died without ever seeing justice served for their daughter. After the death of his parents, Jim decided to purchase the family's old home in Benbrook and move there with his wife. It was his way of preserving Carla's memory and continuing the fight that his parents had carried on for so many years. Then, just when it seemed the case would never be solved, something began to change. In 2019, 45 years after the murder, a new investigative team took over the case. Among them were detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett, who decided to revisit every detail as if they were starting from the beginning. Bennett immersed himself in the case files that had accumulated over decades. Reports, notes, interviews, and long-forgotten pieces of evidence were carefully reviewed once again. After months of examining the records, he compiled a list of approximately 80 individuals who had, at one point or another, drawn the attention of investigators throughout the years. The goal was straightforward: locate those individuals again, compare their past statements, and determine whether any important information had been overlooked for nearly half a century. Without realizing it, the detectives were getting closer than ever to the answer the Walker family had been searching for since 1974. As the investigation moved forward, new information continued to reach detectives. Among the tips was a report from a woman who believed her former husband might somehow be connected to the case. According to her, he had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla and had maintained a large collection of newspaper articles and reports about her murder. The lead initially appeared promising, but it quickly lost momentum when investigators confirmed that he had been out of town during the weekend the crime occurred. After so many years of pursuing dead ends, Wagner and Bennett knew they needed something more substantial. Their best chance of identifying the killer was to find biological evidence that could be examined using modern technology. Fortunately, despite the decades that had passed, Carla's clothing had been carefully preserved in the police evidence storage facility. The problem was the cost. Advanced DNA testing could cost tens of thousands of dollars, and those resources were typically reserved for more recent investigations. With no funding available, it appeared the testing would never happen. Then an unexpected opportunity emerged. A television station producing a special report about Carla's murder agreed to fund the laboratory analysis. That decision would completely change the course of the investigation. When forensic specialists examined the evidence, they discovered biological material preserved on one of Carla's garments. From that sample, they were able to develop a complete genetic profile of the attacker. The DNA was submitted to CODIS, the national database used by law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. Expectations were high, but the result was disappointing. No match was found. The findings suggested that the person responsible had likely never provided DNA to the American criminal justice system. Faced with that obstacle, investigators turned to a strategy that had been revolutionizing cold cases across the country: genetic genealogy. The sample was sent to a specialized laboratory in Texas. Using modern genetic sequencing techniques, scientists reconstructed the suspect's biological profile and began searching for possible family connections. Months later, the first major breakthrough finally arrived. In July 2020, forensic genealogists were finally able to connect the DNA profile to a specific family tree. The family they identified carried a surname that immediately caught the attention of investigators: McCurley. As soon as they received the information, detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett returned to the mountains of case files accumulated over nearly 5 decades. They wanted to know whether that surname had ever appeared during the original investigation. It had. Buried among thousands of pages of reports was a name that stood out immediately: Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. At the time of the murder, Glenn lived in Benbrook, only a few blocks from where Carla had been abducted. Even more surprising, his name had already been examined by investigators back in 1974. The old records revealed that Glenn owned exactly the type of firearm detectives had been searching for at the time: a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. Just weeks after the crime, officers had interviewed him. During that conversation, Glenn claimed that the gun had been stolen from his pickup truck while he was on a fishing trip. He also agreed to take a polygraph examination, and after the results were reviewed, was eliminated as a suspect. At that point, the investigation moved in other directions. Meanwhile, Glenn continued living what appeared to be a normal life. Married and raising a family, he worked as a truck driver hauling construction materials throughout the region. His wife was active in a local church attended by the family, and nothing about his daily routine suggested he could be connected to one of the most notorious crimes in the area's history. But now, nearly 50 years later, detectives were facing a shocking possibility. The man who had been interviewed near the beginning of the investigation and later released without suspicion might be the very person they had been searching for since 1974. If that theory was correct, it meant that Carla Walker's killer had spent decades living an apparently ordinary life while avoiding justice. The discovery involving Glenn McCurley gave investigators something they had not possessed in decades: a concrete direction. Just days after receiving the genetic genealogy results, detectives decided to move quickly. On July 7, 2020, members of the Fort Worth Police Department quietly collected items that had been discarded in trash placed outside Glenn McCurley's residence. The items were submitted for laboratory testing. When the results came back, the suspicion grew even stronger. DNA recovered from those discarded items was consistent with the genetic profile that had been developed from evidence preserved in the Carla Walker case. But investigators still needed a direct sample. To avoid raising suspicion, detectives paid Glenn an unexpected visit. During the conversation, they explained that the investigation had been reopened and that they were revisiting individuals who had been interviewed at the time of the crime. They then asked for a DNA sample, telling him that it would help eliminate him once and for all from the list of possible suspects. Glenn appeared uncomfortable. For a few moments, he seemed to consider refusing. But after a brief period of hesitation, he signed the consent form and allowed investigators to collect a DNA sample from inside his mouth. The definitive answer arrived weeks later. In September 2020, forensic experts confirmed that Glenn McCurley's DNA matched the profile recovered from evidence connected to the murder of Carla Walker. After 46 years, investigators finally had a name. On September 21, a specialized law enforcement team was sent to make the arrest. Glenn was taken into custody without incident and transported for questioning. During the interview, detectives placed a photograph of Carla on the table. For several seconds, Glenn stared at the image. At first, he claimed that he did not know the young woman and denied any involvement in the case. But as the hours passed and investigators presented the results of the genetic testing, his resistance began to weaken. After more than an hour of questioning, he finally changed his story. Speaking softly and avoiding eye contact, Glenn said that on February 16, 1974, he had spent part of the afternoon drinking alcohol. According to his account, he later drove aimlessly through the area. At some point, he arrived at the bowling alley parking lot where Carla and Rodney were parked. From there, his story became even more surprising. Glenn claimed that he heard an argument taking place inside a nearby vehicle. According to him, he believed a young woman was being assaulted and decided to intervene. He told investigators that he opened the car door and got into a confrontation with the young man inside. He then claimed that he removed Carla from the vehicle and drove away with her in his own car. It was a difficult story to believe. And detectives knew that his version of events raised far more questions than it answered. As the interview continued, Glenn elaborated on his account. According to him, after taking Carla from the vehicle where she had been with Rodney, the two talked for a while, and she eventually began showing interest in him. Glenn claimed that Carla hugged him, thanked him for helping her, and that the two ultimately engaged in consensual sexual activity. Afterward, he said that he allowed her to leave the vehicle and that his memories of what happened next were vague and unclear. Investigators found the story difficult to accept. They reminded Glenn that, according to family members and people who knew her well, Carla was an extremely cautious young woman. Furthermore, evidence gathered throughout the investigation indicated that she had never engaged in sexual relations, not even with Rodney, her boyfriend of nearly a year. To detectives, the idea that she would willingly become intimate with a stranger just minutes after being forcibly removed from a vehicle was inconsistent with everything they knew about her. When confronted with those facts, Glenn continued denying that he had sexually assaulted her. However, he eventually admitted something even more damaging. According to his own account, after the sexual encounter, he became afraid that Carla would report him to authorities. It was then, he said, that he strangled her. Even in this portion of his confession, his statements remained inconsistent. At times, he claimed to believe Carla was still alive when he left the scene. At other moments, he expressed uncertainty about the exact sequence of events. The more he spoke, the harder it became to separate fact from explanations constructed decades after the crime. Investigators questioned whether Glenn was confusing memories or attempting to reconstruct events in a way that minimized his responsibility. Meanwhile, the legal process moved forward. In May 2021, prosecutors announced that they would not seek the death penalty. Glenn was 78 years old, suffered from health problems, and, if convicted, could face a sentence of life imprisonment. Following the advice of his attorneys, he initially entered a plea of not guilty. The defense argued that the genetic testing was unreliable and claimed that investigators had applied improper pressure during the interrogation. Despite those arguments, the judge determined that the evidence was strong enough to justify a substantial bond, setting it at $500,000. Unable to pay that amount, Glenn remained behind bars while awaiting trial. When the trial finally began, jurors heard testimony from Rodney McCoy, who recounted in detail the night Carla had been taken from his side in the bowling alley parking lot. Prosecutors also presented hours of recorded interviews, including portions of Glenn's confession. But one of the most powerful pieces of evidence was still to come. During the investigation, law enforcement officers located the Ruger pistol that Glenn had claimed was stolen decades earlier. The firearm was discovered hidden inside his own home, concealed in a compartment above a doorway. The discovery further undermined his version of events. On the third day of the trial, faced with the overwhelming weight of evidence accumulated over nearly half a century, Glenn McCurley made an unexpected decision. He changed his plea to guilty. On August 24, 2021, almost 48 years after the murder of Carla Walker, the judge handed down the sentence: life imprisonment. At last, the Walker family received the answer they had been searching for since that February night in 1974. Justice had taken decades to arrive, but the man responsible for the crime could no longer escape accountability. Today, Glenn McCurley is serving his sentence in a Texas prison. Under the rules of the state's correctional system, he may become eligible to apply for parole in the future, although that does not mean such a request would necessarily be granted. Even after admitting guilt in court, Glenn later changed his position. In subsequent interviews, he claimed that his confession was not truthful and argued that he accepted the plea agreement because he believed no one would believe his version of events. Nevertheless, the evidence uncovered during the investigation, especially the DNA recovered from Carla's clothing, played a crucial role in solving a mystery that had haunted a family for nearly 50 years. But some questions remain unanswered. Investigators who worked on the case believe there is a possibility that Glenn may be connected to other violent crimes committed in the Fort Worth area during the 1970s and 1980s. To this day, however, no additional charges have been formally filed against him, and those suspicions remain unresolved. The case of Carla Walker is a reminder that justice can sometimes take decades to reach its destination. For nearly 50 years, the Walker family lived with the pain of loss and the uncertainty of not knowing who was responsible for that brutal crime. Thanks to advances in forensic science and the determination of investigators who refused to give up, the truth finally came to light. If you've made it this far, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy real-life crime stories, remarkable investigations, and cases that remained unsolved for decades, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. And now, click on the next video appearing on your screen. The next story may be just as shocking and unforgettable as this one.